Hello everyone, I'm going to quickly talk about my shakedown experience with the D09. Now, it was a fairly positive experience. I learned quite a bit with the car, even though it was just for a day. I was able to get a fairly good setup on the car. I did a lot of testing with various components. Just very quickly with the suspension arms, I wouldn't suggest running the red composite front hub carriers. Like the spindle blocks, sorry, they tend to strip out easily, especially with the set screw here. So just stick with the silver dot or gold dot if you can. But overall, the red dot is fairly durable, except when you have a freak accident like so here. The car had a few knocks here and there, drove effortlessly, very durable. It didn't seem to tweak a lot, which was good. I ended up switching out the steering rack, the floating steering rack, for the mounted steering rack onto the main chassis. It just seems to work a lot better than the floating steering mount. I guess the floating steering mount would work best for low grip asphalt conditions. However, it seems to be the norm to have the steering rack mounted to the main chassis for most, if not all, conditions. But you could always test in tune and figure that out. Now with the shocks, I was testing between completely zero rebound shocks, which means shocks that have a hole drilled in the caps. And I was testing with shocks that had a little bit of rebound, which has no holes, in the actual shock caps. And during the testing, I noticed quite a slight difference, and I'll explain to you where I noticed this. Now, right now, I have the car with shocks that have no holes. And one thing I notice when I'm coming around the corners, especially like a tight 180, and as I'm coming out of the 180, I notice that as the car is coming around the corner and I hit the throttle, the car really like pops up off and loads itself onto the opposite side. And so what this does is it almost gives you the impression that the car is about to roll. And what's happening is the shocks are basically kind of the opposite side is basically lifting itself up over onto the other side. And I noticed this throughout certain corners, and I decided, well, let's see how the car handles with shocks that have holes in them. And because I felt a little bit uneasy with how the car was handling with no holes, and so I put on the ones with holes in them. Sorry for the back and forth confusion here, but I mounted the shocks with the no holes, and the car just stayed flat and planted throughout the whole corner. It didn't do any like lifting up onto the tire. There wasn't any like jacking motion going on. And so I ended up testing back and forth, and then I found that the shocks with holes in the shock caps was a lot more predictable, easier to drive, and you're able to accelerate in and out of corners without any kind of like uneasiness with because I it's hard to explain, but I felt like the car was about to tip over, even though it wasn't. I felt that the car was going to tip over when I had the shocks on with no holes, but with holes I could drive that car hard in, out of the corners, accelerate, deaccelerate without any issues. It just stayed on the track. It just stuck to the track. And it just made a lot more a lot more sense to stick with a shock package with the holes in them. And like I've talked to drivers like Gilles Groskamp, and he runs his shocks with holes in them. Okay. But yeah, like my setup, I'm running 450 CST, and pretty much standard. I'm running Yokomo blue O-rings, blue springs on the front, blue SMJ springs on the front, blue SMJ springs on the rear, 3-hole out, which will just stiffen it up slightly, and 2 holes on the rear shock tower. Everything's pretty much stock. I was actually changing the central brace here. I wanted to see what difference it would make by changing it out to like a carbon fiber plate versus this trim buckle. And I found that the actual carbon fiber solid piece made the car handle a lot similar to that of like an aluminum chassis, which I thought was kind of interesting, because I guess it kind of takes away any torsional flex around this area. But I could be wrong. I still need to test this more and more, and I'm going to try this even more so with the thicker carbon fiber central plate. But it's really interesting. Definitely this central link here will definitely make the car generate more steering. If you want to remove some of the steering, definitely put in maybe a carbon fiber central brace. And that's pretty much it. Oh, actually, I did test out the brass weights that mount to the front and rear, and I found, whichever end that you put the brass weight on, it kind of numbs and makes that end of the car, easier and more manageable to drive. So if you want to kind of make the front steering a little bit easier to drive, I put the brass weight on there. That kind of softens things and makes it a little bit more, I don't know, not so much, it does slow it down a little bit. But it really depends on your driving style, whether or not you like it. I also put the brass weight on the rear, and that made the car quite easy to drive and it made the car a lot more, I guess, docile. That's the best way to describe it. In the rear end, it just made it a lot easier to control. It was a little bit slower to react, obviously, than the front. When I took off the weight in the rear really livened up, and it really got, it really followed through with the corners a lot more with the front end than it did before. But yeah, that was my experience with testing the weights. I still need to test a little bit more, try to figure out what's best for my driving style. You can copy everyone and anyone's setup, but ideally you want to find a setup that works best for you. Okay, so that's kind of like my shakedown review. I was really impressed with how the car was handling, and it's definitely a step above the D08. But my heart is still set on the D08. It's going to take a bit to get my heart to tune in on the D09. But anyway, I hope this video was of some help. And if you have any questions, just leave me a message on the YouTube. Okay? Bye-bye.